Hello, hi everyone, and welcome to the second session of today's instalment of Interact Virtual Festival. A big thank you to our sponsors, Balsamic, and all our speakers, and to everyone watching here today. So today's theme is the future of design, and our next talk is on AI and automation with Lia Emanuel. Lia's a senior UX consultant here at Nemensa, and she works with organizations across a wide range of commercial, public, and not-for-profit sectors to help put human behavior and experience at the center of their design and innovation processes. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A box and I'll ask Lia the questions as they come in at the end. If you have any issues with audio or anything to do with Zoom, then let us know in the chat function, and do use that to say hello to each other there as well. But I'm going to pass it over to Lia to share her screen and start today's session. Thanks, Lia.
Yeah, thank you, Liam. So 2 seconds here, we'll get things up and running. Right, so again, thank you everyone for joining in today for this session of Interact. As Liam mentioned, I'll be talking about AI and automation, particularly around how we can drive innovation through collaboration that works on a human level. So, just to kind of give a little bit of an overview of what we'll be chatting about today, we'll kick things off by really kind of looking at what is AI and automation, kind of as we go through and talk about what do we mean by that, and then moving forward, kind of looking at what barriers still exist for adoption in businesses. So while we're seeing AI and automation really kind of take off and explode over the past 3 or 4 years, we still have a few challenges that we can kind of pick apart, have a look at, and see how we overcome. And particularly one perspective I'm quite keen to take in overcoming those barriers is really looking at how we map out collaboration between humans and autonomous technologies. And through that, using 2 example sectors, particularly healthcare and urban resilience and governance, to look at how we can kind of pick apart and map out those collaborations, and looking at how those 2 sectors have really driven innovation through meaningful collaboration. And at that point, we'll take a little bit of a step back and look at some of the wider challenges for UX in the AI and automation areas. So in a former life, before I became a UXer, I spent several years researching how we interact with smart technologies and automation. It was around this time that the Royal Academy of Engineering was tasked to kind of really assemble a think tank of sorts to understand what impact AI and autonomous technologies or autonomous systems could have on the government, on the UK at kind of a business, economic, day-to-day life perspective. And really what they came back was that the implications are huge. The possibilities are massive for the UK, and really taking the time to invest in autonomous systems. And it was really from this steer that led to the UK government investing nearly £40 million in 2014, 2015. Mind you, this is kind of austerity is in full swing at this point. To really pump that money into research and business stimulus packages, to put the UK at the forefront of AI and the automation movement. And I think it's a really good time that we take a step back and look at kind of how we fared over the last 6 years. And I think in my mind, it's really a time where we can refocus to more of like the human side of things rather than strictly engineering, and look at where that can bring us in terms of driving and continuing to drive that innovation forward. So before we kind of drill down into all the nitty-gritty of that, I think it's really important just to kind of think about what is AI and what is automation. And so we can kind of look at automation or autonomous technologies as hardware and software working together to solve a problem. And actually kind of all of us have an autonomous system or autonomous technology in our house right now in the form of a thermostat. So if you think about it, it's a really simple example, but you have sensors in your house, gathers information around how hot or cold it might be. Once it kind of the temperature goes below maybe what you've set it, the heating kicks on. So it kind of finds a solution, albeit a simple one in this case, performs an action and kicking your heating on, and achieves an end goal to get your house back up to a certain temperature. again, we might have, from a kind of person perspective, some input in going, all right, I want my house to be this warm, this cold. But all this really happens with very little to no human intervention. And, while that's a very simple example in this case, when we talk about autonomous technologies, it tends to be kind of a relatively large umbrella term to describe technology like artificial intelligence, machine learning, Internet of Things or IoT, robotics or robotic process automation, RPA, and autonomous vehicles. So you can kind of see that we kind of tend to use autonomous technologies and even AI to really kind of capture this really wide or kind of diverse breadth of technology. If we kind of go back 10, 15 years, historically, we've applied autonomous technologies to really kind of address the 3Ds. So if a situation was dangerous, dirty, or distant, tend to have autonomous technology in place to save resources for it's just too costly to get a person to a particular place to achieve an end goal or do a job, or cost to human life is another one that's quite common. However, these projects, historically, again, kind of 15, 20 years ago, tended to be projects with government or military initiative level budgets. So unfortunately, along with low scalability, you just don't have that many organizations or companies or businesses for that matter that have a couple of £1 million knocking around to really invest into autonomous technologies. However, over the past kind of say 5 to 10 years, we've really seen businesses, kind of everyday businesses that we're interacting with. I'm sure there's a number here that you guys have been working or kind of engaging with. I know I feel like I'm keeping Amazon afloat at the moment through lockdown. But we're really kind of seeing the ubiquity and the scalability of autonomous technologies take off. And this is really kind of into sectors that are moving away from those 3Ds, dangerous, dirty, or distant, and much more into kind of everyday activities. And so seeing businesses really heavily investing in autonomous technologies across transport, manufacturing, healthcare, finance and insurance, and hospitality. And the indication is that it's not really kind of a tech bubble. This isn't something that's just kind of, the potential to kind of peak and then ease back. With Gartner kind of suggesting that global spending on autonomous technology is due to reach around £2.4 billion by 2022. However, even with that kind of momentum moving forward and really kind of seeing AI and autonomous technologies take off across all these different sectors, there's still a number of barriers to organizations or businesses adopting or buying into autonomous technology as part of their business models. And so kind of a good point to look at 3 core areas that really stand out in my mind as to what are some challenges or some barriers to adopting AI and automation. Excuse me. So first off, I think a really important one to consider is the disruption of current business models and ways of working. And you can kind of look at this in 3 slightly different areas. So if you kind of consider yourself looking to invest as a business into autonomous technologies, there's a lot of technical complexity that comes with that. So you can think of things like just expensive resource kit, IT buy-in that needs to happen to kind of ease autonomous technologies within your ways of working. Potential that you need to hire highly specialized roles or teams. So this often includes data scientists, software engineers, and so on, who are capable of managing those systems. And I think probably the biggest stickler is the need to shift your focal point of service to product delivery. And I think a really good example of this is the autonomous vehicle kind of automotive sector. So if you think currently we work on, or the automotive sector is working on a kind of a business model of vehicle ownership. So you're selling a product to an individual, for example. However, if you try and start bringing in autonomous vehicles, there's a possibility that you're kind of shifting your service delivery there. So vehicle ownership may not be a priority anymore. It may be simply the service of mobility, the potential to get from point A to point B, where you may no longer actually need to own a vehicle to do that. And so that just shifts or disrupts their like just entire way of working and how they approach product delivery. Second theme that is kind of important to consider is it can be really difficult just to remain relevant as we're kind of adopting several iterations of autonomous technologies. So a big one here is just the general reliability of AI and autonomous technologies at the moment is often really overinflated. So it's not uncommon to hear kind of experts in the area refer to AI as kind of really at the stage of a 2-year-old child. There's a lot of development that needs to happen there to really kind of get it back or up to kind of acceptable standards in terms of a risk from a business perspective. Second, just the sheer rapid pace of innovation can mean investing in one form of AI or autonomous technology is irrelevant in 4 years or less. And finally, the kind of difficulty to scale up to digital workforce or scale up your digital workforce is really a massive one here. So you can kind of think of it in a perspective where autonomous technologies isn't really kind of a plug and play type of solution. It's something that you need to consider an entire kind of business strategy or organizational ecosystem as a whole, both human workforce and digital workforce, and how those two start working together to really have a successful strategy. It's not really kind of something that you can apply in a fragmented, we're having this challenge or issue, or want to apply AI to this particular project. It needs to really be thought about as a holistic approach. And our third and last barrier is really around safety, trust, and compliance. And I think this is one that really every sector is going to have to grapple with moving forward. So there's certainly a high degree of awareness from the consumer's point of view, just in terms of, are they losing control in the kind of services they're being offered? Are there privacy, data protection issues surrounding the use of AI and autonomous technologies? In the media, there's certainly kind of some stigmatization around AI and automation, around kind of stealing jobs. And finally, difficulty to gain trust and buy-in, particularly buried under technical jargon. And I think for me, this is a really big one that is going to be difficult to overcome. So a good example, I don't know if you guys, I've had the blockchain described to me or explained to me on a number of different occasions. And I can certainly understand the value that it brings in terms of like transparency to certain sectors like journalism or finance, but I still have very little basic understanding on how it actually works. And to me, that kind of, if we're unable to demystify these kind of new technologies coming into play, it makes it really difficult for someone to come in and apply that to their own organizational kind of challenges or problems if they can't really understand the basic kind of mechanics around it. So I think there are 3 kind of really big or important barriers that we need to kind of consider as we move forward. And I think there's certainly one approach that I want to kind of heavily advocate for in terms of adapting to and addressing some of these barriers is the consideration that we don't necessarily need technological advancement to overcome a number of these issues. It's really more pointing to the need to explore new ways of working. I think certainly from a UX perspective, that's just a really exciting time for us, because for me that says this is all about creating new user experiences and really understanding how people and these types of technologies work together to collaborate. I think one way we can start really demystifying that and trying to understand the user experience side of things is looking at how we actually map out collaboration. And in order to, there's a number of different ways that we can do this and a number of different perspectives and approaches that we can take. And really kind of what I was keen to highlight today is we can use really, really simple decision-making models to help us map out collaboration and really help us understand the behavior at play in some of these user experiences around AI and human interaction. So, like I said, kind of looking at really, really basic decision-making models at this point. We can look at a simple one in terms of just a really basic 5-stage approach, where as a person, you might, in your environment, gather information via kind of sight, smell, touch, audio. You kind of take that information and you filter it. You make interpretations about that. You might make judgments about the information that's coming in. And from that, you can kind of make a decision. So choose a best course of action, given what you've gathered from your environment, and implement an action around that decision. And then basically review the outcomes of the action. So has it actually had the intended effect that you wanted it to? And we can look at autonomous systems in a very, very similar way. So a really good example around this one is, again, going back to that autonomous vehicle example and looking at a fully autonomous vehicle, so no driver involvement whatsoever. You might have that vehicle gathering information as it's driving down the road. So having cameras and so on, just understanding the layout and the road and kind of who's on it, what's going on. As part of that kind of sensing the environment, it might see or recognize a stop sign 100 yards down the road. And it, through kind of interpretation of the information, it understands, oh, actually, I need to be able to do something to respond to that stop sign. So it'll make a decision to apply the brakes in the next 100 yards and then actuate that. So physically pressing down on the brakes. And then once the vehicle's come to a full stop, reviewing, okay, do I need to change any of my action based on what I now know and where I am in my environment? So that gives us just a really simple, basic understanding. And again, I think we're at a point where autonomous systems can work completely independently from people, and vice versa. The decision-making model is very much based on how a person approaches and implements decisions in their everyday life. But I think where it gets really interesting isn't where these two things are running in parallel with each other. It's kind of where overlaps and interactions take place. So a really good example of this is a really classic ergonomic kind of airline pilot example. In this case, you might have autonomous sensors on an airplane. So for example, gathering information about the external conditions, so weather, altitude, so on. The system will be taking that information and kind of understanding based on the parameters that it should be running within. It might interpret altitude information, for example, as something that it's not expecting. So gone kind of below the altitude that we should be, something needs to happen based on that. It will then notify pilot. So that's where we kind of start drifting from autonomous system interacting with a person. Notifying a pilot would be using their expertise to gather more information, understand what's happening, and make a decision to increase the altitude, for example. And then at this point, the pilot may take the steering column, physically make the alterations within the control panel, and then both the person and the autonomous system will continue to monitor their environment and make sure everything is back to expected parameters. So again, as I said, we're looking at a really, really basic interaction here. But I think it's one that it's important to highlight, in that Oleg Rogowski, who's done amazing work in AI and is founder of People AI, that's kind of one of the more interesting companies out there, has really hit the nail on the head in thinking about automation and kind of really two sides of the fence here. So we can have AI that automates very kind of low value add work. So there's really simple, basic tasks that we as people might think of kind of low level or autopilot tasks. And that's fine, that's great. And I think there's certainly a number of places where that can solve a lot of challenging problems for organizations and businesses. But on the flip side of that, there's a really interesting area for innovation that we can focus on. That's much more around that kind of idea of co-pilot. And so it's where humans and autonomous technologies are really working together, collaborating as a way to kind of guide, train, and educate humans throughout these different tasks. And so really, I think in my mind, that's kind of where the really interesting pathways to innovation lie. And so I suppose kind of thinking, or with that decision-making model in mind, really kind of trying to look at how we can pick apart some of that decision-making or collaborative processes, particularly looking, as I said, in two sectors that have been embracing AI and automation over the past kind of 5 or 10 years, particularly looking at healthcare and urban resilience as examples, and really trying to map out how they've taken innovative solutions and collaborations between humans and AIs, and really kind of picking apart some of those features and seeing kind of how does it address some of those barriers that we've discussed, and kind of what are the questions moving forward, or kind of what doors has that opened up by understanding those collaborative points. So I suppose first place to start off is just a really, really basic ecosystem of collaboration points, I guess you could say, in healthcare. So you might have a member of medical staff that is interacting with admin staff to kind of admin type roles, paperwork, and so on within a hospital setting, for example. You might have medical staff interacting with patients, and of course, medical staff interacting with other medical staff. And so a couple of the companies that are highlighted on or organizations and companies highlighted on the right have been kind of implementing and exploring ways in which autonomous systems and autonomous technologies can really help support these interactions and kind of, as I said, take much more of that co-pilot role or collaborative role in supporting these interactions. So again, we can look at medical staff and admin staff. Certainly autonomous technologies are now supporting interactions between these two around clinical notes, charting, and scheduling. Medical staff and patients using autonomous technologies to really support mobility issues, so support kind of social and medical needs and well-being kind of away from GP practices or away from more traditional points of contact in healthcare. And then finally, we have autonomous systems that are supporting medical staff working together with other medical staff in terms of improving diagnostics, really kind of that more around that big data sifting to really support research and pharmacological trials. So while this is just a really, really simple ecosystem, we can start really applying this to the that kind of 5-stage decision process to really pick apart how these different collaborative points come together. So if we think of the kind of that first interaction, let's say admin staff and medical staff have the end goal to reduce time spent completing clinical notes and forms, and that enables them to spend more time to focus on the patients. So, for example, you might have a member of medical staff gathering information about a patient, filtering that to record relevant kind of information that they might need to come to a treatment decision, decide what information to verbalize in that point, and the autonomous system will actually help them transcribe that information into relevant clinical notes, forms, in a kind of format that can be used by admin staff and a hospital, for example, at large. And so the autonomous system then kind of carries on, updates their natural language library based on last interaction, updating various algorithms to kind of help improve that system as they continue to work with medical staff and admin staff. And of course, the admin staff are still in place in a collaborative capacity to QA portions of those notes and just making sure that everything's kind of running smoothly at the monitoring stage. We can look at that second example. So between interactions between two medical staff with the end goal to help medical staff utilize more available data across medical communities, and ultimately just help them improving their diagnostics. So you might have two members of staff working together to understand what is wrong with a patient, or what a patient might need that has come to their care. And they're able to kind of utilize autonomous systems to leverage databases from around the world, help them interpret those patterns of symptoms, for example, and recognize best fit matches. And from this point, an autonomous system can also provide kind of best diagnostic decisions or options that those medical staff could take. But ultimately, it's the medical staff's kind of expertise, kind of leveraging that expertise to choose a course of action, appropriate course of action, based on the information at hand. Of course, from this point, you can kind of continue that process to feeding outcomes back into the database that the autonomous systems are using, and then that the autonomous systems are able to regularly update those algorithms. And the final example that we looked at from that very simple kind of ecosystem earlier was helping medical staff monitor and support patients more remotely. So this could be things like improving quality life, enabling somebody to live from home, and preventative medicine, which is quite popular at the moment. So I think you see quite a few of those like apps on your phone and so on that kind of help you track your mood, and you can kind of see how those might help scale up. But in this specific example, you might have an autonomous autonomous ecosystem helping with in-home monitoring. So this is something that has a lot of potential in terms of helping individuals with mobility issues or individuals with dementia, for example. And from there, an autonomous system or autonomous technology within the home might be able to interpret, recognize patient behavior has changed outside set parameters, for example. It may be able to provide necessary alerts, at which point medical staff might be able to use expertise to understand, is a course of treatment needed now based on that alert? It might be able to alert the patient. So for example, action is necessary in terms of you forgot to take your medication, you need to take your medication. All the while, the kind of autonomous system is still in the loop, so to speak, and providing assistance potentially. So providing physical or social assistance, and then still monitoring that the patient's well-being kind of moves back into acceptable bounds based on the assistance provided by either medical staff or the autonomous technology itself. And again, we see people are still kind of involved towards the end in terms of patient monitoring. Do they feel that their needs have been met? Do they need further action? And medical staff monitoring patient trends over time, and just understanding, is current level of support kind of what's needed, or do we need to make some changes to make sure the patient is looked after? So again, these are all kind of fairly simple kind of collaborative touch points, but I think one thing before we move away from this is, in this particular sector, across these three examples, we're seeing autonomous technologies involved at every single stage of the decision-making process. So for this top example here, looking at kind of supporting note-taking and charting, really seeing autonomous systems coming into the end of the process to collaborate with people, whereas leveraging kind of better data for diagnostics, we're seeing autonomous systems involved a little bit more towards the front side of that process, all the way through to almost fully autonomous approach, where the system could run kind of on its own with just a few touch points towards the end. So that's quite a good variety of collaborative points across that process. And we're kind of, by picking apart some of where these collaborative touch points are occurring, we can kind of start to think about how do we address some of those barriers that we brought up at the beginning. And so kind of thinking about the barrier around shifting focal points of service and the service or product a business might provide. I think one of the things that the healthcare sector has done that's kind of enabled them to overcome this barrier is really they're focusing on including people or medical staff or a number of those kind of support staff in that ecosystem where they're most valuable. And that tends to be utilizing or leveraging their expertise and training. So go back to that kind of large collaborative slide. We're almost always seeing a person in the loop at that decision-making process or at that decision-making point. And really that's kind of where you would like to kind of put your trust in a person with medical training, that they're able to take in all those contextual cues and potentially not necessarily only understanding the black and white that you might expect from autonomous technology, but really understanding all those gray areas that kind of fit in the middle and leveraging that expertise to come to a decision. Second point that they've been, I think, quite smart in addressing some of these barriers is thinking about reliability of technology over being overinflated, particularly in the healthcare sector, where you see it's very rare to, or I suppose to put it a different way, in the healthcare sector is traditionally relatively conservative when it comes to risk taking, as people's lives are literally on the line. And so I think what they've done to really address that barrier and move forward from that kind of capability to innovate is keeping a person in the loop at the point of action. And again, this is very similar to that kind of point of decision. So if you've got individuals or humans involved at this kind of latter stages here, it almost acts as a safety net to help mitigate those reliability risks. And finally, kind of thinking about future questions in this particular sector and how we can utilize our understanding of collaboration to move forward, to continue this innovation. I think what's really kind of what picking apart some of these collaboration points highlights is that we're typically seeing human involvement at the start and end of that decision-making process. I think it kind of raises a number of interesting questions. That's kind of what makes these points of collaboration really important for this particular sector. How can we leverage that understanding to kind of new challenges, new goals, to kind of continue that innovation movement forward? And the final 2 points, I think, are something that around the barriers that we spoke about earlier around data protection and privacy considerations. I think certainly there was a lot of hype and a lot of kind of potential around things like home monitoring, which were fully autonomous. And I think just not enough understood around if those types of things were in place, what other data protection measures and policy or privacy measures need to be considered. So something like digital medical records in the UK were a huge hot point about 3 years ago, where it could potentially afford the NHS savings in millions and millions of pounds, and just kind of really helping the, shall we say, gaps or challenges that they're currently facing within the infrastructure. But privacy of sensitive data is such a huge consideration. It's really difficult to get that type of work off the ground. And I think the same is in place here for things like home monitoring. But potentially, by picking apart these different collaborative points, we might be able to identify features that would improve trust and improve scalability here. So just want to move on to that second example, just to highlight how understanding these collaborative points can really help us understand where there may be gaps for innovation or how we can best approach innovation within these sectors. And urban resilience and governance is another sector that's really taken on board how autonomous technologies can be leveraged to solve really complex problems. And so this is often kind of described now as smart cities, but you might have an urban planning, urban management individual who's interacting with people from public services, emergency first responders, and citizens, all kind of engaging in kind of collaborative ecosystems, so to speak. But a number of the companies or organizations and businesses shown on the right have really kind of started to leverage autonomous technologies to improve kind of three main areas of urban resilience. So starting at the top here, we're seeing autonomous technologies help guide policy and legislation, and really helping disaster preparedness. Going counterclockwise, autonomous technologies are being leveraged to notify individuals, particularly urban management, public services such as the electricity grids, water services, just of being able to notify infrastructure vulnerabilities, issues that might be occurring through natural disaster or humanitarian crisis. And finally, autonomous systems are being leveraged to respond to hazardous conditions. And this is much more kind of in line with the kind of dangerous 3Ds that we traditionally see autonomous technologies applied for. But again, we can map that out into this really, really simple decision-making process where you might have urban management and planning utilizing autonomous technologies to gather data. Information about existing legislation and existing policies on the urban environment. We're also seeing people utilizing citizens in this point of view, or at this point as well. So being able to use citizen science and crowdsourcing techniques to understand the urban landscape. At which point you might have autonomous technologies kind of gathering all that information, leverage that to kind of interpret, model, and visualize different ways in which changes to legislation, changes to policy making may affect the urban landscape, and can kind of provide an ideal set of simulations, for example, evacuation plans, the impact of building rights, building permits. And this can then enable urban management individuals to put together kind of final responses and disaster plans into legislation. And at that point, you have kind of more traditional monitoring where, you know, the citizens can respond to that public policy or legislation through kind of quite traditional democratic routes. And the autonomous system can feed back the outcomes to improve modeling as they keep going through for those urban planning points of reference. Second collaborative kind of pathway we can think about is around helping public services and first responders work with urban management with the end goal of monitoring natural disaster and humanity crises in real time. So this one is just kind of utilizing sensors in the environment or using natural language processing of media to help understand unfolding humanitarian crisis, making interpretations on those modeling that data. So from an urban planning or management point of view, it can come to the decision that do we need to trigger those response plans that are in place? Do those alerts kind of point to loss of infrastructure? And do those alerts point to loss of life? And it's at that point can make a decision to dispatch maintenance or dispatch responders as needed, and understand how those actions kind of unfold in real time to the changing information at hand. And finally, just looking at how first responders and citizens collaborating along with autonomous technologies can, at the end goal, kind of enable first responders to safely navigate emergency response situations. So I think this is one that Yorkshire's been kind of trialing their fire department. It's a really interesting area of work where they have robotic systems that can go in to potentially very hazardous situation and gather information around ground safety that then gets kind of shot back to kind of home-based first responders. In that point, the robots are able to interpret and kind of do analysis of the environmental data to help relay that information back to the team, or potentially identify items of interest, such as a person within that situation or citizen that needs help. And from that point, the robot, the kind of autonomous vehicle, autonomous responder, can work with their team to understand, do we need to dispatch somebody in the situation? They can continue on to continue mapping out the area, or stay and relay information. Sorry, my dog's. Apologies. So the robot could then provide assistance with the citizen, and then as you kind of come back to that monitoring phase, the robot would kind of incorporate feedback into its assigned tasks, and the first responders are there to monitor should they be pointing the autonomous first responder into a different direction to execute new tasks or continue on with that task. And I think one thing that's particularly interesting at this point is we're seeing kind of very different patterns here of where autonomous technologies are getting involved in that collaboration process relative to the healthcare sector we looked at previously. So we're seeing a lot more engagement with autonomous technologies at the beginning of this decision-making process, and really kind of leveraging their capabilities to gather data within the environment and model data in the environment. And likewise, we're seeing a lot more kind of almost or excuse me, let me rephrase that, almost fully autonomous ways of working when it comes to the autonomous technology itself. So they're able to kind of nearly run the full gambit of the decision-making process on their own without human intervention. I guess particularly this bottom example here, but points of collaboration can kind of facilitate how that occurs. So slightly different ways of working than the healthcare sector. And again, we can kind of look at how picking apart some of these collaboration points can help us understand how the sector has really addressed some of these barriers that were raised. So first, the first one is kind of the difficulties to scale up the digital workforce that we raised earlier. And I think something that this particular sector has done well is leveraging autonomous technology in places where it's simply just difficult to upscale the human workforce. So, for example, just in terms of resource and cost, the network of sensors that you can put into an environment to monitor flood levels, for example, or weather patterns is going to be currently a lot cheaper than deploying hundreds of people into that environment to take those same measurements. And then often the kind of difficult to scale up the human workforce in situations which could be potentially quite dangerous. So the first responders example. And finally, the second barrier that this sector has done particularly well, I think, to address in terms of moving forward in innovation is trust and buy-in kind of buried under technical jargon. And this goes back to mentioning that in this particular sector, we're seeing a lot more focus of autonomous technologies at the beginning of that decision-making process. So very heavy focus on that kind of pattern and model recognition. And I think generally speaking, there tends to be quite a high acceptance from people that machines tend to excel at this area. So there's less of a kind of, we place more trust in potentially an autonomous technology's capability to handle big data or large data sets than we might do in terms of trusting an individual to do the same kind of level of work. And so kind of looking at what some future questions might be, particularly within the sector, is, as I said, we're kind of typically seeing almost fully or nearly fully autonomous ways of working. So there's autonomous technologies being capable of interacting across every touch point of that decision-making process. And I think some questions remaining on how we can kind of continue to move forward is what features of these minimal points of collaboration make it important to have human involvement. And so kind of by really kind of understanding why those features are important, we might be able to kind of understand how we can apply this to new problem areas, but also understand kind of where might there be value gained in involving people at other touch points. So there might be situations where actually to improve trust, it makes more sense to engage those collaborative touch points earlier on in the decision-making process to tackle a particular challenge within a sector. So kind of stepping back a little bit from that, hopefully getting a little bit of a flavor of what those examples provide, just both across healthcare and across urban resilience, gives you just a better idea of how simply breaking down and mapping out those collaborative points gives you a different perspective to understand how autonomous technologies fit within that ecosystem, and how they can potentially fit into the collaborations that could be obtained in kind of applying autonomous technologies to different challenges across different sectors. And so at this point, I think it's worth taking a step back and looking at some of the bigger picture challenges for UX moving forward, and really kind of understanding how we can continue to leverage those really important human autonomous technology touchpoints. And the first one from my mind is there's a real need to support flexibility and transparency in these collaborations while maintaining usability. And this really takes an interaction design perspective, but you can often see that while we looked at really, really basic ecosystems of people interacting together, you could kind of appreciate how these situations can get complex and difficult quite quickly. I think with that, it's kind of a design challenge from a UX perspective and design perspective of how do we minimize cognitive effort in those types of interactions while maintaining that type of flexibility and transparency that's needed. Second point is how can we best capture, abstract, and represent, share knowledge across these diverse, complex groups of people and autonomous technologies. And this one's, I think, again, it's still very much a design perspective issue, but there's lots of different stages that kind of need to be conveyed. So are we conveying really complex information to help enable a person to make a decision? Are we providing kind of more summary level information to help a person understand what action has been taken? So by picking apart these different collaborative points, I think it helps point us in the right direction of what type of information needs to be shared as people in autonomous technologies continue to collaborate, and potentially what are the best design approaches to do that. And finally, just kind of understanding, I think there's a real need from kind of an interaction behavior perspective to understand the new social ecosystems and collaborative dynamics that are going to be at play here. And so really, in my mind, that's kind of trying to find a balance between a holistic versus nuanced insights into the interaction spaces, goals, and needs that we're starting to look at here. So you can kind of think of it in terms of often even within those really simple ecosystems that we're looking at, we're designing for one-to-one interaction, one-to-many interaction, many-to-many interactions in a single kind of collaborative space. And I think that takes it can take a really fine-grained kind of approach in terms of how much we look at that from a holistic, nuanced perspective. Secondly, how people utilize and engage and act on AI-sourced information may be quite different or similar to the way that they utilize, engage, and act on information provided by people. So there's certainly kind of evidence to suggest that when it comes to aspects of kind of judgment or pulling in more of those contextual cues when we come to decision-making, individuals find human-based information far more trustworthy than AI, for example. So really need to be aware of kind of where AI and humans are interacting as part of that decision-making process, and the type of information being conveyed may actually impact the kind of actions or decisions that are coming into play in this collaborative environments. And then finally, the role of power and status in play for human AI interactions is a really big one. So power and status can govern a sense of trust and comfort and acceptance when it comes to AI and autonomous technologies. And this really has a massive impact on fairly simple design decisions, such as kind of who leads a conversation, where kind of gaze occurs, and how quickly one takes up responses, can all play a role in that power dynamic, status dynamic, and level of trust. So hopefully that kind of highlights some areas in which we can consider moving forward or consider how innovation moves forward across human and AI interactions. And really hopefully that kind of helps provide a little bit more perspective to how can we as a UX community take a step back when considering autonomous technologies and look at it from different perspectives. I think it's important to consider innovation isn't simply engineering kind of cutting edge standpoint, but it's really about how can we think about, test out, and design for new ways of working and new ways for collaborating. But yeah, happy to answer any questions, and thank you so much.
Thanks, Lia. That was great. And yeah, we have got a couple of questions. So Alani has said, I'm a product designer who deals more with data science dashboards, so input models for predictions, etc. What's the best way to use autonomous models in any data science designs?
I think that's a really, really good question. I think certainly from a data science perspective, data modeling perspective, the biggest challenge that I think comes into play is how do we kind of simplify the interaction to a point where it makes those collaboration touch points viable, where it makes them valuable. And I think data science, that is a real challenge, because you're dealing with often dealing with very, very complex ways of looking at slicing data. So I suppose, I mean, there's no one one answer to that question. I think there's a number of avenues that can be explored. And I think certainly in terms of exploring those avenues from a business perspective, it's really important to consider the overall strategy of I suppose from yourself as a product owner. What's your overall strategy for your product? Because I think autonomous technology can't really be just kind of plugged in at one. We're having this one problem in the way that we're looking or modeling data, or we're having this one kind of place or project where it could be interesting to kind of plug in autonomous technologies. I think it needs to be looked at in the ways that how your current kind of workforce deals with big data, what the overall company strategy is, and then considering how those collaborative touch points with your existing workforce could benefit kind of the outcomes that you're working with.
Thanks, Lia. Hopefully that's been a helpful response. And then someone else has asked, can you recommend any reading for someone to get into AI and UX?
Oh, that's a really, really good question. Off the top of my head, I've always been really bad at just viewing kind of titles and authors. If you're happy to get in touch and shoot me an email at my email address there, I'd be happy to do just a little bit of digging and get you the sources that would be most useful for yourself.
Brilliant, thanks, Lia. Does anyone else have any other questions? If you'd like to put them in the Q&A box now. Otherwise, I think we'll wrap up there. But thanks, Lia. That was a great talk, and yeah, thanks very much.
Cheers. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, everyone.